Salvete. I mean, hello, everyone. What language do I speak? English. Hello. Hello, Raphael.
Salvete, hello. Salvete,
Ciao, ciao a
hello.
tutti. Hola a todos.
Ciao a tutti. Hola, hola a
Why put in a
todos.
retracted S on my
Todos.
my Sigma? Hold on, I should probably put these in. Let's see what this does to the live stream if I do this. That's right. See what happens. How am I coming through? Still being heard?
I believe so. For
Look
me,
at that.
yes.
I don't even have to try these live streams anymore. I'm just kidding. Well, I don't have to try when I'm with such a tremendous expert and such a good friend as you. I know you're humble, like, oh, I'm not an expert and everything, but no, Raph, I've known you for a few years now, and since we met, you have been an incredible help to me on this specific subject we're going to talk about today, which is phonology, pronunciation.
Yeah.
You saw videos I was doing in Latin on Scorpio Martianos, and you're like, hey, I love what you're doing, but here's some tips that'll improve what you're doing. And I immediately got better. And have continued. I can't think of a single month that we've known each other where you haven't added something really helpful and important to my understanding of phonology or linguistics or language in general. And yeah, I'm not exaggerating, everybody. I mean, thank goodness I have this amazing friend who's this wonderful teacher of phonetics and phonology, and as well as Latin and Spanish and Italian. So welcome, Raph. Glad you're here.
Thank you. It's really great to be here. I mean,
I like your unvoiced thank you there. That was very.
Thank you.
I think you did that deliberately, right?
Yes, thank you.
Because I say it the weird way. I say thank you, which is, since we're not being prescriptive, right? You taught me not to do that.
We're not being prescriptive. Although you still make fun of me for saying often, but
I do need to make a video about that.
Yeah.
No,
but yeah, I mean, people have probably seen or potentially seen me floating around talking about random things in various videos. I think we have a video talking about ancient Greek pronunciation. We have a video talking about why Spanish definitely comes from Latin, which were super fun to do. But I think maybe some people are wondering, like, who is this person and why is he just randomly appearing in these videos? So hello, everyone. I'm Raphael Turrigiano. I just graduated with a degree in linguistics and Japanese. I'm super interested in historical linguistics, historical phonology, and also phonology and phonetics as applied to second language learning, which is what we're going to talk about here. And I also just started teaching lessons online. You can go to my website and see details there.
The link is in the description, and it's right here on the screen.
Yes.
So if you get R. Turrigiano, that is not unfortunately, but that is a prize. But it is the price of entry. You must be able to spell Turrigiano correctly to enjoy the teaching that this man can and does do.
Yes, it can be a struggle, definitely.
No worse than mine. So.
Oh, well, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I guess we should get started talking about.
Yeah, I was just going to point out hold on, I'm going to get video in case people want to see video that I was just mentioning. Raph was the co-developer, if you will, of the Lucian pronunciation, which is meant to be essentially a way to pronounce ancient Greek, which can satisfy more people, I think. But the video explains a lot, and you can see a lot more about what Raph does and how he communicates there, as well as Spanish, Latin. Hold on. I'll just put in this.
No viene del latín.
No viene del latín. There it is. This one with the kitty, with the little
Spanish is not from Latin, right?
Yeah, those are the ones. Those are the ones. In case you are all interested in seeing them, I think they're really important videos, I think, for this channel. So, So a couple things that we'll definitely talk about today. I know you had some great stuff that I'm looking forward to talking about, but one is retracted S. In fact, guess who knows about that?
That's the only thing we're going to talk about Always. It's just retracted S.
It's a very
the only phonological concept that if you have one takeaway, it's no, I'm kidding. We will talk about other things. I do love talking about retracted S, though. That's one of our
and I want to mention it because
topics.
just because I think it's pretty darn important to the way we might pronounce if we wish to do so in an historical way, being Latin and ancient Greek, as well as noticing that really critical difference between European Spanish and American Spanish. One might go to Spain and learn Spanish really well, but never notice that difference, and then always have that little bit of accent. But it's so easy to at least become aware of and then learn. So
right,
yeah,
exactly. And I mean that's sort of the overarching.
Is it arcing
topic.
or arching? Is it overarching? Super arcaneum. No, that doesn't sound right.
I don't know. Two native English speakers don't know how to pronounce an English word. Typical.
Well, that sounds pretty normal. It's like another day in the land of Anglophones.
Yeah. Oh, are we putting on our glasses? Okay.
I am.
Yeah. Cool.
I mean, oh wow, we look great like this. Hold on, let me zoom in for us. Yeah, we look good like this. I agree. But you were saying.
Yeah. So we're talking about phonetic awareness and phonological awareness, which are kind of sort of two different things, and why we think those are important and why it's worth worrying about. Which, I mean, of course, Luke, you talk about pronunciation a lot. You spent a lot of time and energy convincing people that pronunciation is important. And I think a lot of people that watch this channel believe that to some extent, or to a large extent. But I think to just sort of demystify a little bit this area of language learning that I think a lot of people are just kind of intimidated by, and not just learners, but teachers as well are kind of intimidated by, when it can be very accessible and very beneficial. So I guess if I were to expand on that a little bit, unless you had something to add.
Only something that I want to say for the important part of what we've discussed in actually, do we look better like this? Nah, I like this better. No, I don't know. Vote out there if you prefer the zoomed in version.
Yeah, zoomed or
let's hear your comments. When it comes to pronouncing, a modern language is different. For example, Italian is a language we both know pretty well and we're familiar with, so we would think, oh yeah, we should learn standard Italian. But at the same time, inevitably, if we studied, for example, I studied in Florence and I picked up a lot of Florentine speech traits, which I've since tried to reduce to try to be more neutral sounding in Italian, which is achievable. But whenever we learn a language, people will say, oh, they prefer the British pronunciation to the American version of English, or the Australian one, which I think this is also before, New Zealander. Even Indian, why not? They're all great, and there's a lot of native speakers who pronounce English in a variety of ways. Scottish, of course, Irish, don't forget you, and the Welsh. I think I got them all. Did I get everybody? Okay, good.
Canada? Did you say Canada?
Darn, I said American, and that's in the Americas.
Oh God!
Right?
Careful now. In the Americas, yes.
I'm being inclusive.
Yeah. North American, yes.
I'm being international. And it's just that people, I think the emotional component, which is inevitable whenever we care about something, an emotional component that goes into pronunciation of like one is superior to another, is something that is best to not worry too much about. And when it comes to an ancient language, what's right, what's wrong. We've talked often about the debates. Oh, ecclesiastical pronunciation versus classical. I like both, and I use both more and more regularly, both of them. The various pronunciations of ancient Greek, as we discussed, that really any of them are fine. The only issue is that people end up not realizing that their own subjective, other people, actually probably better said, that an individual's subjective preference for its specific pronunciation. For example, that subjective preference might be, I don't care that much about how Latin pronunciation might be. I'm comfortable with my accent, which is a German accent or an American accent or British accent or French accent. I say, fine, great. I speak with Latin speakers every day. with all kinds of great accents, and it's fine. We all communicate. It's not a big deal. So this is not something that I would ever, if I did, and I think I may have in the past said, we should do it this way. And now I don't really feel that way anymore because it's clearly not an obstacle.
Right.
At least for Latin. Greek's a little bit more complicated, but anyway, I just want to throw that out there.
I mean,
that said, go ahead.
Well, so what, I mean, I completely agree. You know, this conversation is not going to be about, you know, this, you should learn this pronunciation for this language or this other pronunciation. Of course, we do kind of sort of prescribe a pronunciation for ancient Greek, but it's really more of a just, here's an option for anyone who's interested. It's not everybody should. Exactly. We're not saying that everybody should pronounce Greek the way that we want them to pronounce Greek. No. It has nothing to do with that. And what I really care about is not convincing people to pronounce things a certain way. What I care about is getting people to a point where they can pronounce things the way that they want to pronounce things, right? So everybody, I mean, maybe not everybody, but most people, when they learn a language, they have some aesthetic notion of what they like about that language, what they would like to sound like. You know, often when someone learns a language, especially if they really enjoy learning that language, like if it's not for a job or something, they enjoy the sound of that language. And it's a wonderful thing to be able to reproduce that. And so if that's a goal for you, it doesn't matter what pronunciation you are interested in within that language, because there will be many different pronunciations usually. But the ability to say, okay, this is a way of speaking that I would like to emulate, and I'm going to train myself in order to do that. Not, you know, the goal is not perfection necessarily. It's not like, you know, to be able to pretend to be a native speaker. I mean, it can be, but it doesn't have to be. But it can still just be an incredibly valuable thing to have in your toolkit is phonetic awareness and phonological awareness. So I think the best way to understand this is in the context of language learning in general, and the concept of comprehensible input, right? Which is basically the foundation of how languages are acquired, is you take in the language and you understand the majority of what you take in, and that, you know, builds up your proficiency in that language. And so this is why it's so important what you're doing, Luke, in creating all of this content. No, I mean, you know, there's a reason why why you just hit 60,000 subs. Congratulations.
Well, no, I mean, well, thank you. I just wanted to add and emphasize again, that's so much of what I do and talk about and have enjoyed being able to talk about is I knew stuff before we met, but you took my understanding and knowledge of phonology so much higher than it was, and I wouldn't be able to talk, wouldn't be in grado di, what is that in English, capable of? I'm sorry, the bilingual podcast is in 2 days, everyone. Sorry, not this one. That's the Italian one. Italian English one. Con Davide. The in grado di, is that capable of? It just feels right to say in grado di. I would not be in grado di speak about the things that I do now without your constant helpful the advice that you've given over the years. Yeah, so I interrupted you, but thank you for saying, but I feel like you're been a partner of it from the beginning for a long time. Well, yeah,
it's always nice to be interrupted when someone is stroking your ego. So but you know, you're creating all of this content, a lot of which is specifically designed to be comprehensible input in Greek and in Latin. And you really champion this method that uses other materials that have been developed to work in the same way, like Lingua Latina per se illustrata. And so the sort of fundamental concept of what's going on there in terms of why this works so well for acquiring language is that you basically have content that is exactly at, or slightly above, rather, the level that you're currently at. And so you're able to gain new information and also reinforce structures by taking in those messages and figuring out the handful of new things based on the context that you understand.
Examples of comprehensible input would be the Famiglia Romana book and the Lingua Latina per se illustrata series in general. Aleph with Bet, where they teach biblical Hebrew.
Your own 2 series for Latin
Lingua Latina
Greek.
Comprensibilis and Ancient Greek in Action are all example. French in Action, which is a huge source, and the Destinos for Spanish are all these wonderful examples of comprehensible input that I've actively used or have been obviously working on.
Yeah. And so in many cases, though, so Lingua Latina per se illustrata is a sort of interesting example because it's so much content that for many people, at least, is more or less perfectly set up so that you're always just getting, messages that are barely above your level. Although, of course, there are some maybe flaws with it. Some people would say in terms of too much new information in certain parts of the text. But for the most part, it's probably the most effective, large-scale, comprehensible input project that anyone has ever created for a specific language. But in general, and even with something like Lingua Latina per se illustrata, there's a degree to which additional explicit knowledge will be useful and will make that input more comprehensible, so that you can make more effective use of it. So if you really don't actually understand what's going on in the input that you're taking in, then you're going to get less benefit from it. And so it's important to not go overboard and exclusively teach how everything works in a sort of mechanical way. That's the sort of traditional grammar translation method of language learning that I think the topic has sort of been beaten to death, but it's pretty clear is just not very effective and not very efficient. But a certain amount of explicit information can be incredibly valuable. And I think that's exactly what is the case with pronunciation, because the vast majority of people learn pronunciation just through input, right? So they take in input, and to some degree, they manage to varying degrees, they manage to replicate what they're taking in. Some people, without any kind of explicit instruction in phonology, do an extremely good job of replicating the system that they're taking in, and other people have more difficulty with it. And so you end up with a range of results. This is more particularly in the context of someone learning a language that has native speakers, when you can very clearly judge in comparison with the language as it's natively spoken. And so learners see this range of results for different people, and they say, oh, well, this is just a matter of innate ability. Some people have an ear for it, other people don't. That's just how it works, so it's not worth worrying about. And if it's really, if you're really not interested in pronunciation, that's totally fine. However, I think that this is sort of a bit like if you said, well, some people have an easier time memorizing vocabulary, which is true, and other people have a much harder time. So therefore, you shouldn't really worry about learning vocabulary too much, because some people will learn a lot of words and some people won't learn very many words at all. And of course, that's not the case. You need to learn words in order to learn the language. And so if you have more, like I often have, a lot of difficulty memorizing words long term when I learn languages. So I use various tools to really reinforce that vocabulary so that I can keep it memorized in the long term. Like Anki, for instance, is a spaced repetition software. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And like without Anki, it would be way harder for me to learn vocabulary.
I agree. Pardon me, Raph. I just wanted to tell all of our people in the chat, if you have questions at all for Raph, like I said, to me, he is an expert in this stuff. And so you may have some questions about specific languages or topics that he's bringing up. Please ask, because we'd love to address your questions. And you've asked some questions already, which we'll get to in a moment here when we take a pause. Go ahead, Raph.
Yeah. So I think there's tools that are actually much more approachable than one might think, which one can learn, that make it so that you can listen to the target language and understand actually to a large degree what's going on mechanically in terms of the sounds that you're taking in, both consciously and subconsciously.
I have the IPA vowel chart ready whenever you want to show it.
I have it up too as well.
Oh, good. Yeah, you can share stuff as well.
we'll
yeah,
get to that, I guess. But
cool. Right on. Excellent.
we'll get to some specific examples so that this all becomes very clear. But once you understand how sounds work, or really when you understand some pretty basic concepts about how sounds work, and you get some practice with them, it just becomes so much easier to listen to the language that you're trying to learn and take it in and internalize the pronunciation system and then later output. And of course, the result is never going to be perfect from the beginning, but that's when, in the same way as with, you know, the proper nuances of how you use certain words or various grammatical structures, you'll get it wrong a little bit at first, and then you output and maybe you get correction. You can use native feedback to gradually improve your pronunciation, where you can sort of, if you understand exactly what you're doing with your mouth and with your vocal tract, you can make these small adjustments intentionally until native speakers say, oh, wow, you know, I've never heard a foreigner pronounce this word that way. You know, I've never heard a foreigner manage to pronounce this sound. And, you know, once again, this will interest some people more than others. But yeah, it's really an incredible tool that I think should be made more accessible to people. And that a lot more people than currently would be interested if they knew how accessible it was and if they had, you know, good access to resources for it.
Yeah. Yeah, I can think of a couple of people with outstanding, who are not native English speakers, but have such convincing, shockingly good accents, like Davide Gemello, who I think is in the chat, and he said hi.
Ciao, Davide.
He likes our glasses.
Great glass.
Yeah, we're going to chat with him live in a couple days.
Glasses.
That's right. Yeah, and who sounds so American, and to the point where I find it uncomfortable. Or I used to, you know. But yeah, and I think he achieved that, and we'll probably talk about it too in a couple days. But what you're talking about, he learned the IPA vowel chart, which I'm going to throw up just because I want to. There, so he learned these kinds of things and was able to do that to add the very, very native-like nuance to his speech by understanding that kind of thing.
Right.
And I think that's exactly what you're talking about. It's readily doable if people just haven't had the tools. You know, the typical pronunciation guides in whatever book, even for native English speakers, which is what we're used to saying. We're saying, oh, the vowel e, as in perché, is like the English word they.
Right.
But without the y, if they add that, which is great. But then it's like
right. But it's often not very useful, and it doesn't teach English speakers how to actually make that sound in a way that's useful, right? Because that information can be a good starting point. You can tell an English speaker, oh, you know, you have this sound sort of in this context, although it's linked to this y sound that you have to get rid of. But then, you know, English speakers are like, well, how do I get rid of that?
It's amazing how little people know, and it's not their fault. They just haven't. I've always been into it. So I was already at this really, like, very receptive level for the kind of stuff that you started guiding me on a few years ago. Yeah.
So maybe if you throw up the vowel chart, we can actually
vowel chart.
We could talk about this a little bit, because this is a perfect example of something where people
like
look
to share
at
it with
this.
sound too, so people can hear it. Oh wait, I can't do that one. Wait, where'd it go? Oh no, I have to do it.
I mean, you can just do the sound for us, Luke. You can just pronounce all the vowels.
No, but I like hearing him go. Ka, ka. Sounds like a bird.
Yeah.
I love that guy.
Yeah.
Man, that must have taken like a year of his life to record all of those. All right, tab with sound, share audio, and there. All right, here we go. So for example, go ahead. You tell me where you want to go.
Well, I mean, so I just wanted to say about this. This is a perfect example of something that people look at when they, like, let's say someone says, okay, I want to learn about Spanish phonology. So they like go onto the Spanish phonology Wikipedia page, which is a great resource. It will have a ton of useful information once
it's also a great step, because most people don't even do that.
Yeah. Well, that's true. But a lot of people will do that, maybe at someone's recommendation. And they'll look at something like this and they'll be like, oh God, what is this? How do I even begin to make this make sense or make this be useful to me? Right. But there's actually just like three basic concepts that you need to understand. Ignoring the specifics of what each symbol is, that doesn't really matter. That you can learn in the context of a language, just like how you would learn the alphabet of a language in the context of a language. You can worry about the specific symbols for specific sounds in the context of the language that you're studying, maybe in comparison with your native language. But
I never remember this one.
Which one?
This one. What is this one?
Oh.
Oh.
I can't see your mouse. So
Oh, you can't? Oh, can you hear it?
Oh.
This one.
Oh, yeah.
Say highlighted?
Yeah. No, I see. Sorry.
For example, just to give an example of, I love this stuff, but there are vowels on here that I don't use in the languages I work with normally, and therefore I don't remember like that one. But so we know the ones that we need to do the languages we work with, like Spanish, Italian, Latin, Greek, and so forth.
Exactly. So there's really only three very basic concepts that you need to understand in order for this to like start being kind of useful for you. So I guess we could just teach a little bit of beginner articulatory phonetics, which is that so you make vowels with basically the position of your tongue in relation to the rest of your mouth, which makes different shapes that air then passes through, and that's how you get different vowel sounds, right? And so this diagram is actually in the shape of a mouth from the side, right? So
this is the front of the mouth, and this is the back of the mouth.
Exactly.
Left,
so you have the roof of the mouth, the front of the mouth, which is near the teeth, and then you have the bottom jaw, basically, and then you have the back of the mouth / throat. And your tongue can sort of move around in 2 dimensions anywhere in this space. And so one way to go about feeling this is, and sort of gaining awareness of what your tongue is doing in your mouth, is just if we take some example sounds. So in English, we have the vowel E as in feet, and then we have the vowel A as in bat, or if you're not an English speaker, just an A, like in Italian, that works too.
Right, this one.
Yeah, that one. And if you transition between those two sounds, if you say yeah, you can actually feel that your jaw opens up so that your tongue can go lower, and it's literally moving further away from the roof of your mouth, right? So when your tongue is close to the roof of your mouth, when it's high, then you have the sound E, and then when it's lowered, you have the sound yeah, and then you have different sounds in between those. So A, for instance, is between those two. Yeah, right. So that's one axis, and then you have another axis going from front to back. So you have E, once again. It's not only is it high, not only is it close to the roof of your mouth, but it's also forward. It's close to your teeth. And then if you say oo, like in Italian oo, or even in English oo will work. You can actually feel, if you transition between those two sounds, you, like literally, if you're watching, try doing this. If you aren't familiar with this stuff, you'll literally feel your tongue. Yeah, you'll literally feel your tongue moving forward and backward, right? So that's concept number 2, which is that you have this front-back axis and you have this up-down axis. And then the final thing to understand for this to be useful is that your lips, generally speaking, will do one of 2 things. They will either be relaxed, as in the vowel E, or they will be rounded, as in oo. And you can see my lips make this rounded shape, oo, right? Or O is another rounded vowel. And with those 3 concepts, the fact that your tongue can be closer to the roof of your mouth or further away from the roof of your mouth, that is high or low, the fact that your tongue can be closer to your teeth or closer to the back of your throat, that is front or back, and the fact that your lips can be rounded or unrounded, that is relaxed, those are the only 3 variables for all of the vowels on this chart. Every single one of them is just your tongue is in a certain spot in regards to front, back, and up, down, and your lips are either rounded or unrounded. And some languages will do sort of other interesting things to make new vowel sounds. So like Latin, of course, has long and short vowels, which we can.
And these are just qualities on here. Yeah,
Right.
these aren't
These are the vowel sound itself, the shape that
yeah.
your mouth makes in order to make the vowel. And maybe that is like too much information to process right this moment, but I
Oh, it's great.
promise when you get into studying the phonology of the language with these basic concepts, with this phonetic awareness of what your tongue actually does to make different vowel sounds, you can start to gain an appreciation of the phonological system of your language. Of, okay, these are the vowel sounds that exist in this language. Your tongue is roughly in these different positions. Your lips are either rounded or unrounded in order to make each of these vowel sounds. And that can be incredibly useful for when you're learning new vowel systems in a foreign language. So, of course, it takes practice, and you have to go from the phonetic awareness, which is phonetics is literally what your mouth is doing physically, to the phonological awareness. Phonology is the system of sounds that exists in a language. And once you start to build that awareness, then taking in the language, you will actually acquire that phonological system and be able to reproduce it naturally and very consistently.
Might be a little bit like when one starts to play the piano. You just like, oh, I got to do this thing with the keys, and sound comes out. But you might not do it with. You might not understand how to read music yet. You're just kind of like going through motions as directed by a teacher, and then eventually the system, the phonological system, in this metaphor, in which case it'd be like a music theory. Not necessarily, in some way becomes more clear. Like, there's 8. There's an octave because there's the 7 basic notes, and then diatonic scales and all those kinds of things. Yeah, I'm gonna take some questions and comments.
Yeah, sure.
All right, I'm gonna go back to the top here. It does indeed, good sir. I'll take this out. And yep, retracted S. We will talk about absolutely. And excellent. I'm glad.
I like the siren emojis. Yes.
Yeah.
This title promiseth. Yes.
And we got some votes for
you
Zoom
and
no
me
Zoom.
both.
So let's see. People think I look good in glasses, evidently, and I'm sure you as well. French in action, yes. Exactly, Christopher. Is it Laszlo? Am I saying that right? Laszlo, I think. Anyway, yes, French in action. I did a video about it here on polýMATHY. You can check it out, and I do a little description there, or you can find the link in the description of that video, and I'll give you everything you need. Let's see.
Another great comprehensible input resource for French is what is it called? Le Français.
The nature method.
I don't speak French, so I don't know. I don't know how to pronounce the title correctly. But
in the French in action video in the description. If not, someone put a comment there, and then I'll.
Yeah.
Good.
You can get a free PDF online.
Exactly.
It's like Lingua Latina. It's like that series.
Yeah. Very good. And Ion Academy or Ion Academy. Ion Academy is doing it. The whole thing. They just put up another video today, actually. Looking for. Do you translate?
Do I translate Latin text? I try to avoid translating Latin text. I have actually translated one. Well, it's not an ancient text. I translated one poem by my personal favorite Latin poet, Alexius Cosanus. I have a YouTube channel. I was about to say polýMATHY. I'm not polýMATHY. I don't have polýMATHY. Yes, Paleogloss. I have a recording of a poem by Alessio. It's a beautiful poem. I tried to recite it beautifully as I could, and I put a little translation. But no,
I enjoy reciting his poems. I haven't done it in a couple of years publicly, but I love his poetry sounds. Yeah. Okay. Teris asking about the pronunciation of L in Latin and the velarization of it. I can frame it a little bit with Sidney Allen, who is also responsible, along with Stewartville, for a lot of this stuff that we deal with today. Wonderful philologists. So when I critique them, it's just because I've read some other stuff that's a little bit more recent. And so the notion that Latin has more than one L sound is derived in part from somewhat more recent 20th century stuff like Sidney Allen's Vox Latina, which is a great book, an excellent book. And also based on the fact that ancient Romans speak about there being two different L sounds. The problem is,
sometimes three.
Or sometimes three. The problem is not that there might not have been different phonetic realizations, because there doesn't seem to be a phonemic difference. It's and the difference. If you explain phonemic versus phonetic.
Sure. Yeah. So this is another concept that potentially sounds like kind of arcane terminology, but it's really quite simple. A phone, that's the basis of phonetic, right? A phone is just a sound. It's like literally a thing you do with your mouth to make a sound. So that's a phone, right? And a phoneme is a sort of abstract concept of a sound that contrasts with other sounds in the system of a language, in the phonological system of a language. So for instance, in English, we have this vowel and in some dialects of English, it's only ever pronounced with one phone, with one realization. So it's that sound that I just made, So someone might say man and cat and bat pretty much the same way. Maybe, if you look at it with a spectrogram, you can, find some minute differences, but for the most part, it's exactly the same.
Do you? You don't do those the same natively, do you?
No, I don't. So for most American English speakers, the vowel is actually slightly diphthongized, meaning it's sort of it shifts a bit from one mouth position to another when it's before sounds like N or M. So for instance, I say cat with just but then I say man. So I don't say man, which would be a more sort of standard UK pronunciation, right? I say man, as opposed to but just in that context. So I don't say cat. That sounds like a different accent from mine. But so those don't contrast with each other, right? I can't have one word that's pronounced man and another word that's pronounced man, right? Those are, even if I pronounce it slightly differently, it would still sound like the same word to my ears. And the reason for that is that and although they're different phones, they're different actual sounds that you're making with your mouth slightly, they're allophones of the same phoneme. So basically, in your brain, in your sort of mental concept of the language, in your mental grammar, because phonology is actually, it's part of the grammar of the language, just like syntax, just like morphology, conjugations, word order, that kind of thing. That's all grammar too, but phonology is also part of the grammar that you have in your brain of a language. And so in that sort of mental grammar, you have different allophones of phonemes that will appear in certain contexts.
Right.
And so basically the argument that Sidney Allen is making is that there was an allophonic distribution that is allophones appearing in certain contexts in a systematic way. In Latin, that was exactly the same as his allophonic distribution in English of the L sound.
Specifically RP.
Specifically RP, which is, the most sort of standard upper class UK English variety.
So two L's in RP would be, like, not in my, and then when I say light as a northeastern United States speaker of English, it's light and it's slightly velarized. Whereas if it's RP, it's a light, and it's more like the sound of Italian. That's called the bright L sometimes, right? As opposed to full, which is quite a bit more velarized than when I say full. Though it's not quite a bit, but slightly more velarized than full instead of full.
It can depend on the speaker, the degree of velarization, which is basically, whether, so when you make an L sound, the tip of your tongue is touching the front of your mouth, l or ol, and then the back of your tongue is either raised if it's velarized, ol, or it's relaxed, l, if it's
Right.
like in Italian, like leggere. So in Latin, at various points, it does seem to be the case that there were different distributions of allophonic realizations of L that can account for certain observable phenomena, or even potentially the observations of some of these grammarians. Although it must be kept in mind that, when one Roman says there's 2 allophones and when another says there's 3, and they don't even actually have the concept of an allophone yet, and other people never mention it, it's really hard to interpret.
And because you'll have grammarians at different periods describing a thin or exilis L sound as well as a pinguis or sound. Now, Alan decided to conclude, which it's not linguistically insane, it's reasonable as a hypothesis, that the pinguis or the thick L sound was velar. But that's a subjective description, which doesn't really tell you much linguistically about what's going on.
And he links it to 2 things. He links it to later developments in some of the Romance languages. And he links it to earlier developments in sort of pre-classical Latin with some vowel shifts. The problem with this is that this is precisely the kind of thing, the realization of L, that can change in either direction quite quickly in very specific speech varieties, resulting in all sorts of fun developments. So we're going on a little bit of a tangent here, but it's always fun to talk about historical linguistics.
I think this is exactly this is right on the subject.
It's true,
I think
true.
And
but really what I meant is I was about to go on a bit of a tangent, if that's okay, like giving an example of in Romance.
Sure.
So in Spanish, if you ask someone what's the word for tall in Spanish, they'll say alto, right, with this light L sound, just like in Italian, alto. But it turns out that was actually a learned borrowing from Latin. And in Old Spanish, so 600, 500 or more years ago, people said otto, not alto. And the reason why they said otto is because altus in Latin, which at some point would have become alto, just like in Italian, it was either, depending on which hypothesis you accept, already velarized, alto, or it became velarized, and so it was alto. And this velarized L sound, ol, often in many languages becomes a w sound. So actually, a very good example of this that many of our listeners may be familiar with this is Brazilian Portuguese.
Oh, it's going to be Polish.
Oh, well, Polish also,
right,
actually, yes.
Brazil.
Polish is another great... Brazil.
Like Łukasz.
Or Raphael, my own name.
Brazilians. Raphael. That's great.
It's great.
Brazil.
It's adorable. I love it.
Yeah.
And so, you have a shift from alto to auto, and then au often simplifies to just o. It's a very common sound shift. And so you get Old Spanish, otto. Or another hilarious thing that happens in one of my personal favorite Romance languages, totally not because I'm biased or anything.
Catalan, Sardinian.
Is in Sicilian.
Darn it.
So this is a good example of Sicilian and Italian are very closely related varieties. Italian has no signs of velarization whatsoever, right? You just have alto. Sicilian, on the other hand, in many dialects, because it varies depending on dialect as well, you have the same word is pronounced avuto. And so the question is, what happened there? How do you have alto in Italian and avuto in Sicilian? What happened is you have altus or altus, depending, and then it either was inherited as velarized or it became velarized altu, and then it became wa, so autu, and then the wa became a va, so avtu or avtu, maybe it was bilabial at first, avtu, avtu, something like that. And then that was hard to say, so they stuck an additional u in there between the v and the t, so you get avutu. And that's the Sicilian equivalent.
I wonder if Sicilian does that with Greek words that have been borrowed, which would be like, I don't know, aftos or whatever. If they added that little syllable. If it did, I think it would be very interesting. Yeah, be interesting.
I have no idea.
That's cool. Yeah, and so the I think the I think what's being described by the Roman grammarians is not velarization. And it's because not only are they inconsistent, but they say the exact opposite of what Sidney Allen prescribes. One of them, I'm trying to remember who it was. But I took a note of it so I can find it later. If you write it in the comments later after this post, and I'll go find it for you, and I'll post it in the description later on. Who specifically says that like in the word well, which is a way to say or, V-E-L, well, well, and also ille and bellus or whatever, he says that's specifically the XIII, the thin version. And then he describes pinguis as the other one. It's like the exact opposite in terminology. And or something close enough to that where it completely throws into doubt the idea that they have any idea what they're using in the terminology wise. And really what is pinguis or XIII, what's thin or thick as far as these sounds go is just a subjective term. It's like saying that Russian or German are harsh languages. It's probably just because we've heard, this is usually the reason I think people consider those two languages harsh sounding, is we've heard them in the context of James Bond movies or World War II movies, where we have some kind of aggressive military type person who is using the language in a way which sounds aggressive, so we interpret those languages as being aggressive.
Well, and just stereotypes cloud people's perception as well.
Yeah.
I mean, as in, I know that my perception of Russian changed a lot once I actually studied it a little bit and had Russian speaking friends.
There's a Vilarel. So what you include on when we spoke with Dr. Calabrese a couple of years ago, we asked him about this, and I think you already had a good answer anyway, right, Raph? Which is that Italian already has a very thick sound by its palatalization of a geminated L sound, like bello. It's not bello. It's not the
I mean, there's certainly variation in how the Italian L is pronounced in different contexts, although it's never fully velarized. But there's definitely variation between more palatal and more velar in different contexts. But I'm not confident that the Romance evidence really says much about the distribution of different allophonic realizations of L in Latin in general.
Standard Italian, Northern Italian through Eastern Romance doesn't show any velarization. So that gives me the idea that I would say, if you want to use what Sidney Allen is prescribing, I'd say, okay, that's a reasonable explanation. I think it could even be the voice of some ancient Romans in the classical period, even with the velar L. But there's no way it could possibly be descriptive of everyone or the standard Roman city urban pronunciation, simply based on the way the language is spoken there that evolved from it.
Do we have any other questions?
We have lots, yes. Davide was confirming something that you clarified a moment later about the oo. Because in English, oo is usually diphthongized for most speakers, not Scottish accent, right? Just oo, I think, right? You lived there long enough. Could you confirm that? Am I right? Scottish pronunciation of English?
Yeah. So,
or I mean, min. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, I mean,
Craig. Hey, Craig, thanks for being a member, my friend. Yeah, absolutely. That is helpful.
Fa sol la ti do we practice in singing.
Yeah.
Helpful. Actually, this is a very interesting question. This is maybe a good example of how certain kinds of training can give you a sort of subconscious awareness later on, because I've actually noticed myself that often people with musical training of some kind, not necessarily just people with training as kids, but just people who are very interested in music or did music at various points in their lives, because they've sort of trained themselves to listen to things in just sort of a very general way, they end up actually having an easier time acquiring new sounds and new phonologies.
Makes sense.
And so, but once again, this is not the kind of thing where you should say, oh, well, I was never into music. I never studied music, so this is beyond me. Not true. Even if, this is something that you find challenging, if you just apply yourself, if you're interested and you apply yourself, you learn the basic information, and then you just learn the language, listen to the language, practice a little bit, get some feedback, your pronunciation will improve. And it's also, you can put as much or as little effort into it as you want, right? It's not an all or nothing thing. It's not like either you sound exactly like, the typical accent from your native language, or you sound perfectly like a native. And if you can't sound perfectly like a native, then there's no point in studying pronunciation. No, it's not like that
I
at
don't even
all.
sound like a native anymore. The man who knew
the
too much.
the slight the slightest bit of awareness and of studying of phonology will have will help you with learning the pronunciation of the language that you're targeting. So
yeah. Thanks, Craig.
That's
Thank
what
you
I'd say.
for being a member. And Logan asks, are teachers common who teach phonetics explicitly when teaching some language? Learning German in college was basically all up to me.
Yeah, so this, I think, is one of my biggest complaints about sort of the modern institutions of language teaching, is that often they ignore this element of the languages that they're teaching, even if their methods have become much, much better in a lot of other areas. They ignore pronunciation when I think it can actually be a really valuable thing for someone that's just starting out at a language. Because the other benefit to phonetic awareness is not just how you sound, but also your ability to understand what you're hearing. So there's all sorts of fascinating and somewhat complicated but totally learnable processes that go on in my own native American English, where certain sounds sound very different depending on the context, depending on the phonological context, what sounds they're surrounded by. And someone who doesn't understand those rules might end up having a more difficult time understanding me when I'm speaking in the way that I speak natively, like when I'm talking to you, Luke. And so if I notice as a native speaker, if I notice that someone is having difficulty understanding me, I'll change the way that I speak to try to make it more understandable for them. But then if they're trying to watch a movie or a series or listen to two other people having a conversation, it'll be difficult. And so this kind of building of awareness will allow you to understand what's going on and what you're hearing, and it will allow you to train yourself to correctly interpret the sounds that you're hearing as, instead of just a stream of sounds, as actual words. So this is why I think it really, even for people who aren't super interested in pronunciation, if they're studying a language, especially in a sort of organized program like at a university, I really feel like more time should be spent on going into how the pronunciation of the language actually works.
And teaching this in a systematic way that the IPA always did.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, well, just to finish in terms of whether people are doing, so people are doing this increasingly, and it's sort of language specific. So for instance, with Japanese recently, I'm a Japanese learner still, I would say. I mean, I can speak, but
日本語が。懐かしいね、日本。
but なんだと。
イタリアの方が懐かしいけど。
確かに。
So
Japanese has something called pitch accent, which actually, coincidentally, works probably extremely similar to how the accent worked in ancient Greek, the pitch accent of ancient Greek. And so studying a bit of Japanese pitch accent can also be useful for someone looking to emulate ancient Greek pitch accent when they're speaking Greek. But pitch accent is a part of Japanese learning and teaching that for the most part has been ignored, and people have said the same kinds of things. Oh, it doesn't matter. Oh, you'll just either acquire it naturally or you won't. People will understand you either way, et cetera, et cetera. There's no point in spending time on it. And
hand me that bridge so I can eat my sushi.
Right. And so many members of the community have sort of changed their minds about this, and there are teachers who are really doing a great job of teaching it. So, for instance, there's a YouTuber who's famous for he's American, but he does comedy in Japanese, Dogen, and he's
insane.
Yeah, he's
so
incredible.
Good.
He has an incredible native-like pronunciation.
Blows my mind every time I see his videos.
And if you subscribe to his Patreon, he has a course teaching Japanese pronunciation and pitch accent, both actually. All the fun and gritty details with great examples and visuals. And so that's like a perfect example of someone who's filling this space now. And like, I mean, similarly,
YouTube.
that's sort of
What
a
we
niche
do.
that I'm hoping to fill a little bit.
Apropos, if you
in
would
terms
like
of,
to get trained by Raphael, then the link is in the description where you can sign up for his lessons.
right. Yeah.
That's right.
Mhm.
Oh, and if you
Does
please
that
continue. If you
chart
had
also
this is a question about
is
ayin
this
and aleph.
ein and
Those are
aleph?
consonant sounds.
Those are
Lord Roca,
consonants, yeah.
actually, and we'll look at a
Should
consonant.
we?
We can there's some we'd have to pick. We take a language, but we have actually
Mhm.
quite a number of other interesting questions, I think. So let's go and take a look at this. They came from a half hour ago. This is a good one. Thank you. Is this hey Fabrizio? What is the best way to learn all the vowels from your desired language?
Right. So I think there's stages, right? In the same way that there's stages in terms of learning the language itself and acquiring the language itself, I think you want to start with learning a bit about just how vowels work and practicing it a little bit. But that's basically just the information that I already explained. There's additional information that could be explained depending on the language, or even in general. But for the most part, it's just that basic stuff. Learning that phonetic awareness initially, and then studying a bit about just the explicit information of, okay, this is the number of vowels in the language. So like, for instance, when I was learning Italian at the beginning, everybody told me there were 5 vowels because there's 5 vowel letters. But there's 7. There are 7 vowels, right? There's I, E, A, O, U, right? 7 vowels in Italian. And it wasn't until a friend of mine pointed out to me, you're pronouncing this word wrong because you're using the wrong E sound. Instead of E, it's supposed to be E.
Dammi una pesca.
Until someone pointed out to me, I had no idea that this was the case, and I was just completely ignoring it. But once I learned that that was the case and I practiced differentiating those sounds, I was able to listen to Italian and acquire the difference. I think Portuguese also has the same difference between E and E.
It does.
So that's sort of the third step, right? Is first you've learned a bit about how vowels work. Then you've learned a bit about the actual system that you're trying to learn, how many vowels there are, approximately where in the mouth they're produced. You practice producing them yourself. At first, you won't be able to 100% of the time consistently produce them correctly, but with practice, you'll improve. And then you listen to a ton of the language. You listen out for those distinctions. You can even listen to audios of
Signal check. Raph is frozen on my side. Someone in a comment let me know if it's him or me. Oh, hey, Raph. I don't know if I was freezing or if you were. Hello. I'm checking.
Did everyone hear what I was saying, or did I?
You cut out just a moment ago, about 30 seconds ago. But I'm asking. It was apparently you were frozen according to comments. But yeah, go ahead and say what you were saying again.
From where? Okay.
Hi, this is Raph, and he's going to talk to us today about phonology.
We're going to do the whole hour-long podcast again. Yeah. So so in the context of Italian, you heard that part, right?
About that.
I learned
right, and I said someone mangiando una pesca. That was, I think,
right
before you cut out.
I listened to a bunch of Italian. I said that. Yes. I listened to a bunch of Italian, now knowing the difference between these things, and that allowed me to acquire it. And so basically, by going in these steps, first you practice. First, you learn about how sounds work. Then you practice the specific system. You read about and understand and listen to and practice the specific system that you're learning. And then you just listen to the language. You listen to words in the language that make these distinctions that you're trying to acquire. Both consciously and subconsciously try to pay attention to these sounds, but also just get tons of input as you're learning the language in general. And then when you're outputting, when you're speaking, solicit feedback. Ask native speakers, hey, am I distinguishing these sounds correctly? Do you notice anything that's off? Often they will not be able to give you detailed information in the way that a phonologist can, or they won't be able to say, this vowel is too closed or this vowel is too open. But what they will be able to say is, this sounds off or this sounds correct. And based on that input, you can make adjustments. So if an Italian says the way you're pronouncing,
just that that people have different accents, and if you're going for a certain accent, the person you're speaking to might not have the accent they're seeking to acquire.
Right.
Like if you're studying standard Italian and you ask maybe someone from Torino, who might not have the same kind of vowel distinction we were just talking about for a certain word, and so I guess basically the native speakers are very important, but you might find different native speakers later telling you different things.
Exactly.
For that exact reason.
So be aware of what accent you're trying to learn and the accent of the person that you're talking to. If you're trying to learn Brazilian Portuguese, maybe don't get too much feedback from a European Portuguese speaker, or vice versa, etc. But also there's stuff in general that will be the same across the whole language. So for instance, most of course it varies from accent to accent, but most English speakers can tell you if you're pronouncing the difference between and a correctly. So many people who learn English have a problem distinguishing words like bet from bat, and those are two completely different words for me, and to many non-native speaking people who aren't really aware of the fact that the vowel in bat is more open. And the vowel in bet is the tongue is slightly closer to the roof of the mouth. People who don't have that awareness will just have a lot of difficulty. As in, one time I had someone tell me, "No, you're not pronouncing those differently. Those are the same thing. I don't believe you." And so by building that awareness and listening to native speakers and soliciting feedback, you can say, "Hey, am I pronouncing the word bet as in bet sufficiently differently from bat as in bat?" And a native speaker will be able to tell you at the very least either yes or no. You don't necessarily want anything other than a yes or no from them, because then they might tell you something that's totally wrong. But yeah, that's that. Those are the steps. Explicit knowledge at a general level, explicit knowledge targeted towards your native language, input, output, and feedback, and then more input.
I'm going to add timestamps to this. I'm going to make a note to have a timestamp at about 55 for that question. Wait, this is on... wait, what is the question? No, it's the learning your language's vowel system, right? Okay.
Oh, hey, it's quil. Yes,
I know. Wait, we're like a half hour behind on these questions. Oh wait, quil. Who's that?
That's my Italian friend Giovanni, who is literally the one who told me 8 years ago or something, "Hey, you're not distinguishing e and e." So
grazie Giovanni. Because you set him on this path to be my valued colleague and friend. So I just wanted to compliment Piotr for this David Bowie reference, which means there's 2 so far. Thank you for the David Bowie reference. I approve. So we've got 2 of them in. All right, let's see your other comments, folks. Oh wait, there was one up here. I almost
the Piotr actually said a comment just briefly about palatal sounds, which is another great example of the difference between palatal T and non-palatal T. Like, what's the word? Like in the word дети, like children in Russian.
Perfect.
At first, when I started learning, I can't speak Russian, but I studied it for a little bit. And at first I could not pronounce these sounds correctly. I just could not. And so I looked up, what is my tongue supposed to do when I make these sounds? I practiced it. I went to my, the native speakers that I knew, and I sent them recordings, and I said, "How's this?" And they were like, "No." And then sometimes they were like, "Oh yeah, that one's good." And then I wouldn't be able to replicate it. And then over time, I practiced. And I mean, I don't know, maybe a Russian in the comment will now say, "No, you're totally saying "getya" wrong." But but I think at least back when I was actually studying, I got it more or less correct. So any sound, no matter how difficult it seems at first, if you practice it in this way that I'm prescribing, it is learnable. No matter what level of innate talent you believe that you have,
just like vocabulary, just like grammar. It's like, there's nothing. I think people are actually, when you were talking about the example a few minutes ago, I was thinking about how people, I think, are particularly self-conscious. Not only people tend to be self-conscious about language because we have to speak in order to do the thing. So inherently, I think we get, even in our own languages, our native languages, someone might criticize the way we pronounce something. I know that can happen. I don't think we encounter that nearly as much in English, but I think it's pretty common in French and Italian language for native speakers to receive that kind of feedback of like, oh no, it's not Bosco, it's Bosco, or whatever, whichever one it is. Actually, I don't agree with the standard pronunciation. Anyway, I think it's etymologically wrong, but whatever, La Crusca.
Maybe we should address this question. Can you comment on the use of cultivating good pronunciation in ancient languages? Specifically, that's where you get lots of people saying it's totally negligible.
Absolutely.
Did
I miss that one? Or were we coming up on that one?
It's a bit later, but
okay, I'm still at 5 minutes, 5 hours 7 or at 7 p.m. local time.
Apologies to all the questions, but
no, this is great. We'll
seems particularly.
I like this one. Yeah. So go ahead.
I mean, yeah, I think we really should actually talk about this because you
say the question
so much
again because
So the question was, can you comment on the use of cultivating good pronunciation in ancient languages specifically? That's where you get lots of people saying it's totally negligible,
right?
Which is true. And there are different benefits. I would say there are different reasons to really study phonology of an ancient language than there are for modern languages. But there are still very good reasons, I think, if it's something that you're into. So one is just if you're interested in the language on an aesthetic level, like I am. I mean, I think most people, if you told them, like, here's how this ancient language sounds, if you can press this button, you can be able to pronounce it exactly like that. Most people would press the button, right, to like have that skill. And that's, of course, it's, in real life, it's not a button. It's a bit more, a bit more effort than that, but it's not that much more effort than that. It's you just have to apply yourself to it. And so there's the aesthetic argument, and that's, everybody has their preferred pronunciation. Everybody listens to the language, even in ancient language, because of course we believe that ancient languages should be spoken actively in order to promote actual fluency in the language, even if your goal is just to read. But so, anyone will have a preference for how they would like to hear the language being spoken. And so I feel like they should have the tools to be able to pronounce it the way that they also like to hear it. And so in addition to that, however, there's the fact that actually in many cases, the things that we are accessing, the literature in particular of ancient languages that we are accessing, pronunciation is often a very important part of that. So any kind of metrical text in Latin or Greek or Sanskrit or Arabic or Persian, the rhythm, which is really basically the length of consonants and vowels, because all of those languages, well, I don't know about consonant length. Many of those languages distinguish long and short consonants, and all of them distinguish long and short vowels. Well,
Persian, Sanskrit, Arabic, yeah, absolutely.
Persian is long and short consonants also. I don't know.
Persian speaker.
It wouldn't surprise me. Yeah, so if anyone speaks Persian, let us know. But vowels definitely.
Classical Persian, like ancient Persian, or not, or old Persian. I mean.
Right.
One of those.
And there's all of this wonderful poetry, and I just want to go on record and saying I am not saying that you cannot enjoy metrical texts without worrying about pronunciation. I'm not saying that whatsoever. What I'm saying is it's
because then you're just getting information, and it's somewhat translated. The same reason that we don't. I think that's sort of that's the strongest impetus I could give. I think the most beautiful poetry ever written was by ancient Romans and those who have imitated their style in Latin, even more than Greek. I love the Greek poetry, but I think the Roman a little bit cooler. And for this specific reason, it's just not. If something is translated about it, poetry is untranslatable because unlike prose where you can get facts out and because those of us who aspire to speak an ancient language like Latin and to read it with fluency, we know that we're doing that because we want the language to be part of who we are, just as it could be to study French to read Molière, to study and speak Italian in order to appreciate Dante through Italo Calvino. we know that if we just are working in translation, we're missing something. But that's just prose. If we're not doing, or not all of it was prose, some of it was poetry I mentioned. But if it's poetry, then there's some other somewhat musical element which is therefore not, which is not in it. And if we are subtracting the musical element, it's like, I mean, there's lyrics to a lot of good songs, but if you remove the melody, it's not the same thing, and the intent of the author is not received.
Right.
So I'm a little bit teensy-weensy bit harder than, you can enjoy it somewhat, but it might as well be in translation.
But there are elements of it that you will enjoy, and I mean, I think this is in particular true with so in the case of Latin, what often ends up happening is people put a lot of effort into, they feel like the meter is an additional thing that they have to learn on top of the poetry, and they have to like learn how to do the meter in order to read the poetry. And there are a handful of instances where that's actually kind of true, in that there are some instances where there are, little metrical tricks that are actually different from how the language would be naturally spoken. But for the most part, if you just apply, well, I'm talking about like, in Catullus 5, I think there's deinde, which is pronounced with a diphthong. Dein.
That's the normal pronunciation, yeah.
Is it? Oh, is it one syllable normally? No.
Well, that's the thing, because we see that even in Cicero and stuff that's not metrical. No, and I remember you taking the Catullus course too, where they probably taught that it's a diphthong here for the meter, and no, the poetry is basically a guidebook to natural pronunciation. And that's
interesting.
And we can definitely have discussions about
that. Makes sense that people would have said deinde, because it's just easy to say.
They say the same thing about multu ille in the first few lines of Virgil, that multu ille, because it's a complete. I don't know, it's not confirmation bias, but it's one of those kinds of fallacies where they think, multu mille is the normal pronunciation because that's how they were taught for all those years. And then they get to multu ille, and they're like, what is this? Oh, that's you allied through M's in poetry. And they think, that's a poetical feature, not realizing that's a natural part of the language. Yeah.
But still, usually in Latin, two vowels next to each other, unless they're a pair of two vowel letters next to each other, unless they would normally indicate a diphthong. Generally, they indicate two syllables. No, like normally.
It depends on the word.
I mean, it depends on the word. Yeah.
It's there. Yeah, the e put together could be diphthong, or it could be two syllables.
Right. But sorry. So the point that I was making is that is the point that you are making excellently, which is that. When you know how the ancient pronunciation as we've reconstructed it works, you can just read any metrical text in that pronunciation, and it's in the meter just automatically, because it was literally written in the meter. And so if you pronounce it the way they pronounced it, you don't have to change anything about how you read it in order to read it in meter. It's exactly like how maybe you have to have a little bit of awareness of how iambic pentameter, for instance, works in Shakespeare's poetry. But for the most part, if you as a native English speaker just stress words as you naturally stress them, then the lines are written in that meter. And so when you're reading the poem, da 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 da, that's the rhythm of Shakespeare. It just comes through.
And that's the argument that David Crystal makes in his work, which is that if we pay attention to what the poetry is telling us, it reveals the natural pronunciation of that time. Like reason and raisin were pronounced the same way. You have or any other number of wonderful little things that we can tell because of rhymes and other aspects. The person who because the idea that language changes as much as it does has not been as clearly understood, I think, until more recently. And I think in general still today, people don't really have an intuitive sense that languages change. They're aware of different dialects and accents within their own language, but not that this is truly something that's changed over time, because people aren't necessarily that even willing to accept that Shakespeare's pronunciation was so radically different from the way RP or even American English sound. But this is it. This is so just like David Crystal demonstrates with Shakespeare's poetry. This is the key to how the language is spoken. This is not some sort of poetical thing. Just the same with Catullus and all these other things, multu ille and Virgil. That these are this is just how the language is pronounced. And I want to sing your praise on one other thing. because I was with you, and I barely gave you an assistance at all while you were studying Latin on your own with Familia Romana, and I was so excited. It was just a couple years ago, too. Remember, what's it, 3 years ago? It was a while ago, but
3 years ago, yeah.
3 years ago, you were going through Familia Romana on your own. I was so excited for you to get to chapter 34, which is the penultimate chapter, but that's really the end of the story for me. And it teaches poetry, and you had already given me some excellent phonological tips to improve my Latin pronunciation at the time. But you were still learning Latin, which was a really interesting situation. And then, and I was so excited for you to get there because you've been pronouncing Latin with all the phonemic vowel lengths. You already knew enough about Japanese and conceptually how to do it. So you're doing it perfectly. So when you got to the poetry, and I think I have the recording somewhere, and I want to find it because I wanted to hear you actually recite. It was the Non Ego Nobilium, I think, or maybe it was the Catullus. Yeah.
Yeah, it was that bit. Yeah.
And you just read it the same way you were reading the text from the chapter, from the prose part of the text. And your recitation was 100% perfect, was flawless. You were preserving meter simply because you were reading the language with phonemic vowel length from the very beginning,
right,
and incorporating that into your speech. And it was a wonderful proof of concept that if one learns with phonemic vowel length from the beginning, Latin or ancient Greek or Japanese, whatever it is, then you don't have to relearn it later as something additional.
And so I actually want to bring up the example of Japanese because and vowel length in particular, right, is something that many people say it's not worth worrying about at all in terms of Latin because it's too difficult, right? And usually these are people who are speakers of Western European languages that don't distinguish vowel length or not in a way that's sort of independent of semi-independent of stress in the way that it is in Latin. Where both long and short vowels can be where both stressed and unstressed vowels can be either long or short. And it's precisely the same kind of, I guess, intimidation, because everybody knows, I think, that in theory, it's part of how the poetry works. But what people are really saying is not that you wouldn't get anything out of it if you learned it, because they would still press that button if they could press that button. I think 99% of people. What they're saying is that it's too difficult. It's not worth it. But the reality is, I studied Japanese in university. In the very first few lessons, our teachers taught us, a bunch of native English speakers for the most part, not exclusively, but pretty much, how to distinguish between long and short vowels in a way that's completely independent of stress, because there is no stress in Japanese. There's pitch. And why did they teach this to us? Because you literally will not be understood if you don't distinguish, koko means here in Japanese and koko means high school, right? If you can't make that distinction, you will not be understood. There's so many words where you just will not be understood.
Yeah.
And it's not that difficult to learn. It's not that difficult to teach. It just takes a bit of teaching of what you're doing with your mouth, and a bit of practice, and a bit of feedback, and a bit of input, and listening to the language. And every single person, all of whom are native English speakers, all of whom certainly have a varying degree of ability to naturally pick this stuff up, all of them have it, right? All of them accurately pronounce long and short vowels all the time in Japanese. And so in the context of Latin, I'm sympathetic to the fact that this isn't how it's been done for the most part, and so it's difficult to change the institutions such that this is taught. Once that's in place, everyone can acquire it, and it can be really helpful, especially when studying meter later on. It just makes everything so much easier to understand.
The most important part of the classics is being able to appreciate the poet. That's my biased opinion, but
it's
once you get there, once you get there, it's like, oh, this is life-changing. This is the best thing I've ever been able to, it's great. I agree. Of course, you and I are in agreement.
And then, a funny sort of additional example of this is pitch accent in Japanese, which is an example of, unlike the vowel length thing, you can speak Japanese without
Taihen. Oh, my pitch accents are all wrong. I could do the Hashi example. That's about it.
But
yeah.
people. So this is an example of something that I have been trying to study on my own because it wasn't really taught to me, and it's not taught because you can actually speak, and as long as there's context, people will understand what you're saying, although you'll sound awkward and you might be misunderstood if you say individual words with the wrong pitch accent. But so because you can speak Japanese and be understood while ignoring pitch accent, and because it does take some know-how in order to teach it and some effort in order to learn it, people say the exact same thing. Oh, it's not worth worrying about. It's not worth studying. But the reality is, then if you look at a language like Chinese, right? So tone and pitch accent are just two different ways of doing a very similar thing. It's distinguishing meaning through pitch, right? Every single Chinese learner has to learn the tones. If you don't learn the tones to a decent degree, not perfectly, but to a decent degree, my impression, although I'm not a Chinese speaker, but my impression is that you will be hard to understand if you just completely ignore tone. If you speak Chinese atonally, you will be very hard to understand. And so everybody studies it from the beginning, and everybody acquires it, maybe not perfectly, but like to a decent degree. Every single Chinese learner who actually studies it and goes the distance and really learns the language. And so it's just yet another example of, well, these guys are doing it because they have to. We technically don't have to achieve our specific goals, but it will help us to incorporate some of what they're doing over there. So let's do that. And so, that's my attitude in terms of teaching pitch accent in Japanese comparing to, say, Chinese. And that's my attitude in terms of teaching vowel length in Latin as compared to Japanese. So, yeah, this is a common issue, I think. But yeah.
Yeah. And you're lagging for us just a bit, Raph, at least on my end. You are. Hopefully
Was I comprehensible or?
Yeah, you're still comprehensible. We're still lagging a bit, but I think this is a quick one here. Does IPA specify what type of rounding is necessary to pronounce a vowel, namely protrusion and compression? I'm pretty sure the answer is yes. Yeah.
Well, so IPA has all sorts of diacritics that you can use to distinguish very minute differences. Although, of course, there's actually infinite variation to how a given sound can be produced in practice. It's just there isn't infinite variation in terms of the distinctions that we can hear. And so at a certain level, the differences become so minute that it actually doesn't matter because even native speakers vary within a range, and all of that sounds native, right? All of that is like within the range of how the language is pronounced. But so this is an example of a difference that is actually audible if you train yourself to hear it. The difference between rounding, as in u, or compression, as in the Japanese u sound. So like when I say, I don't know, kuru in Japanese, the vowel it's not kuru, right? The vowel is also slightly more, a little bit more fronted, but there's a distinction between compression, you can see my lips are sort of, I'm exaggerating, but my lips sort of flatten out, as opposed to rounding, ooh, as opposed to being relaxed, which is, right, where my lips aren't doing anything. The IPA can distinguish that when you need it to with diacritics. But that's a perfect example of the thing where it's just not worth worrying about unless your language has that. So for instance, if you're studying Japanese and you see the little compressed lips mark in the context of the u vowel, that's like then an important thing to say, oh, what is that? What does that mean? What is this describing in terms of what a mouth actually does to make the sound? And once you learn that, then you can pronounce words like kuru, as opposed to kuru, or kuru, or however you might naturally pronounce it, depending on your on your native language. Yeah.
Kuru no.
Kuru
Yeah.
no.
I missed Japanese a bit. Raph, you're lagging just a wee little bit. I wonder if if you could diagnose that. If I don't know if someone, if you had.
I mean, I have my connection is supposedly completely.
Oh, it's solid now. You're fine now. Just went away. Okay, cool. We got a.
I could leave and come back.
No, you're good now. Sorry to interrupted you. I'm trying to get to all of your questions. Thanks everybody for your questions and comments. This is great. I'm really happy we have all this. Asking about I can't pronounce your name very well. Were secondary accents before and clicks ever pronounced as in modern Greek with emphasis and additional stress? or before loss of pitch with a rising tone. We were just talking about this.
There's a couple different ways that one could
Yeah.
interpret this. Well, do you want to say something about it, Luke?
No,
before I ramble?
because we need to actually make a video about this. I think it's probably best for our listeners to patiently wait for us to make the video. We promised
Yeah.
over a year ago that we'd make about pitch accent, where we discussed
That's true.
how we would do this.
Yeah.
We'll make it next month.
We'll do We'll do
Okay.
a pitch accent video.
All right, we'll do that. I would say probably the new accent that's being added to it is the one that ought to be observed more than the original natural word or the original word accent. That would be
Exactly.
my really simple way to say it right now, but we need to do
I
a
would
whole
agree.
video to talk about because there's a lot of possibilities. I would say learn the spelling really well, along with long vowels, so at least you can apply whatever you learn later. All right, I'm catching up here. I'm at 5 p.m. in 16 minutes, moving forward here, trying to get did I say? I'm pretty sure I probably said y'all. I've lived in Alabama. I've lived in the South. I'm okay.
I mean, I say y'all. I'm from Boston, so
y'all's convenient. That's other you
Yeah, that's
guys,
right.
and y'all's a little. I think y'all's gonna win. Craig asks, why do we have such variations? Is it because people just hear each other differently? So variations in a native language.
Can you? Why do you have such variations? It's because people just hear each other differently. General hypothesis of mine. Well, I mean, I guess the question that you're really asking is why do sounds change from generation to generation? Because that's really what's happening, right? Is basically when a group of so from generation to generation of speakers, little minute changes gradually build up. So, for instance, there are certain vowel sounds that I pronounce differently than my parents. For me, the word COT and the word CAUGHT are pronounced identically. Caught
Right.
and caught.
The caught merger, which I do not have.
Luke does not have.
No.
And neither do my parents, right? So it's, in my region at least, it's a generational difference.
Absolutely. Very common in California, and also pin-pen is a merger that when I got so confused and I moved to San Diego and people said I had, wait, hold on. Oh gosh. I every time I try to do this, I can't find an actual pen. They're always markers. Darn it. Hold on, I'll find one. I got drawers. Okay, there's one. I'm just the worst at this. Okay, so people would, I remember in San Diego, I remember good old Michener, Cadet Michener. Yeah, he's a B-52 pilot now. You wouldn't think it at the time, though. Anyway, great guy. He said, hey, Ranieri, hand me that pin. Like, pin? It's like I voted pin? What are you talking about? Yeah, the pin. What pin? The pin that's in your hand. I have a pen in my hand. That's what I said, he responded. The pin. And I'm like, and then I started paying attention because, of course, I've been interested in language since before I started my Air Force ROTC training. And I noticed, like, oh my gosh, this is a Southern California merger, and I just had never heard it, because in most Hollywood stuff, which is also Southern California, you have a more, I think, general American pronunciation. That specific thing, it's not unique to Southern California, but it was definitely there prominently, and I noticed it, and I found it very interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
So the sort of general concept, I guess, that has been observed by linguists doing research on this, is that children, when they're acquiring their first language, prioritize the way that their peers speak, the way that other children of the same age of them speak, over the way that their parents and older individuals speak. So at the very beginning, when a child is very young, they're mostly acquiring language from their parents. But once they start coming into extensive contact with other children, they will model the way that they speak based on other children. And so this is how you get these generational differences that spread, right? Each generation. And then the other thing is that every time language is transmitted from one generation to the next, in the same way that biological organisms have mutations, right? Well, language also has mutations. It's not acquired from parents perfectly. It's acquired through your brain takes in massive amounts of input, and it basically builds a grammar of the language. This is somewhat controversial stuff, but let's pretend that it's not controversial for a second. Your brain basically builds a model of the language in your head based on that input. But you have different sources of input. You interpret different pieces of input differently. Sometimes maybe you mishear things. So everybody maybe remembers especially English speakers do this all the time. They'll say a word and other speakers will be like, what? And it turns out that you've just been pronouncing that word wrong your whole life because
You mean it's not
you read it.
volcano? I said that as a kid. Because this shows the degree of my youthful arrogance, where someone said it was Vulcan and not Bulkis. No, it's Bulkhead with a but, and I didn't. Was that the stupidest thing ever?
That's adorable.
But it's very me, isn't it?
But yeah, so often these mutations, quote unquote, will disappear once children come into contact with other children, because they'll remodel their speech based on how everyone else talks. But sometimes, rather than the person with the new feature remodeling their speech based on other people will remodel their speech based on the person with the new feature, right? And so in precisely that manner, this feature that has developed sort of spontaneously through mutation, through maybe a mishearing or just some other process in the brain that's sort of impossible to really understand with our current scientific knowledge, that will then get spread to all of these other kids, and voila, you have, a new way of speaking for just this tiny little
in Greek thing. Or English.
Right, exactly. And so these changes are often imperceptibly small initially. Like, until I learned about this in my linguistics courses, I had no idea that the way that I pronounced cot and cot was different from how my parents pronounced them. I never noticed that. And neither did my parents, until I told them I pronounce these words the same. And they were like, what? How do you pronounce those the same?
And that's why I think that's how certain things can get through. The very reason that I say thank instead of thank, which seems to be my mother does as well. She says thank instead of thank with a voice the, which is, I would go ahead and say, is not wrong. It's just a minority pronunciation, just like the caught isn't wrong instead of caught, like I pronounce them. But I natively don't do the three-way Mary, Mary, Mary. And I'm doing them the way I natively do. But I'm able to train myself to say the Downton Abbey Mary. She wanted to get married, wedded to, what was his name? I forget. So Mary, darn it, Mary with an A, Mary. So Mary, and then Mary is happy. Mary, like the.
Are all three of those the same for you, Luke?
Yes. Are they for you? Do you have them?
Two of them are the same. So I would say.
My mother has a two-way, but my dad has three-way non-merged.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I have so I have Mary, Merry, versus Mary, which is either Mary or Marry.
So the letter
Mary,
A is A for both.
The name, and yeah, exactly. So I have Mary and cool. Mary. Yeah,
and I think the reason that the variations can coexist for a while is that we don't really notice until we get confused. Like with the pen, that was an example where I got confused. And then there becomes something kind of social pressure where if there's a confusion, people will make fun of each other, and then that will develop out through generations to become one version or the other, either a breaking apart or more likely, I think, of fusing together the sounds. But it depends, I guess. And the other one that I was thinking of is the rare thing with the a versus a is that some people, older people in this region, I think it's still native in Brooklyn, distinguish can from a can. A can is a receptacle, whereas can is the verb. I can open a can. My dad does that. I didn't know that until I saw that really cool 1957 TV episode where there's some linguist, someone basically like you, who's talking about all these cool variations in American English, which are different at that time. Craig thanks you, by the way. And also thank you. Now I have to pronounce your name. Abedonergal. Thank you very much. I hope I pronounced that adequately, for being a member today. And for as long as you like to be. I really appreciate it. Dear Linguist, how you doing? Good to see you. You asked, what are the best CI resources for Spanish? I believe it's Destinos. If you just Google that, you should find the website right away. Destinos, like destiny, but instead of a Y at the end, it's OS, Destinos. And if you write a comment later on the video after it gets posted and you can't find it, I'll be happy to post a link there.
The other thing that I would recommend is a much more recent thing, which is this YouTube channel called Dreaming in Spanish.
That's good.
Where there's this guy, and he basically makes tons of comprehensible input videos. He's on camera, he's showing objects, he's saying the names of objects, he's drawing pictures, describing the actions that are happening at different levels. So he has super beginner videos, which are for people who know literally no Spanish, and you'll still understand what he's saying in the video based on what he does on screen. There's beginner, there's intermediate, there's advanced. I already spoke Spanish when I found his channel, but I always recommend that to people who ask me for resources for learning Spanish. Definitely check that out.
Tremendous. Is it time to talk about retracted S?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can always let's see how much I can condense this. Okay.
I can do the introduction and you can
go for it.
Clean up. Okay. Usually, if a language has a sh sound, which by the way isn't the same. I just watched a YouTube video guy who's an American English speaker, but instead of saying sh and ch, he was saying sh and ch, much more retracted, like Russian. But that's a variation within English anyway, and his S was more retracted anyway. But I think I was guessing. I thought maybe from Chicago, but he saw it was speaking basically general American, like upper Midwest pronunciation. Anyway, but if there is a sh sound in a language, usually what that will do is because the sound of S, just like any of these sounds, can be variable in any speaker or group of speakers. For example, Sean Connery is a native English speaker, right? But Sean Connery and Patrick Stewart, both of them, but they have a more retracted sh. The tongue is more tighter, sh, which gives more space for the s to come back. So there's, say, the torpedoes #1, like Patrick Stewart will pronounce, or shaken not stirred. So so when there's a sh, usually that pushes the S sound forward, as it does in Italian, and I think the majority of native English speakers to have a s, which is more laminal. I realize it. This is how I describe it, and please clean up for me linguistically here. But I realize it by bringing the tip of my tongue essentially below the lower incisors for the way I natively do it, and then bring it behind the top incisors, which ends up resulting in a lower pitch. Toccate.
Yeah. Okay, allora. So, yeah, I mean, in terms of the actual position of the tongue tip for these different S sounds, it can vary from speaker to speaker and language to language. And that's actually often not the important thing in terms of hearing the difference. It's how far forward or how far back the tongue is when you're making this sound that can be anywhere on a spectrum from sa in English, or maybe even further forward in some languages, to sha, also in English, right? So in English, I have sip and then I have ship. Whereas in Spanish, when I speak Spanish or when I speak modern Greek, like if I say the word aftos, right? Aftos, or if I say todos los seres humanos, right? In zapatos, yeah. So you'll notice that the S sound is sort of in between my English S and my English SH sh sound, right? So it's not todos and it's not todos. That's todos with a more English-like S would be like more of a Latin American, depending on the variety, more of a Latin American pronunciation of Spanish. But todos, sort of between the two, is how peninsular, like European Spanish tends to sound. And this is just sort of a phonetic detail that's kind of fun to work on if you're really into the idea of like trying as best as possible to reconstruct the ancient sound of Latin. But if that's what you're into, which is what I'm into, then basically there's a couple of different sources of evidence. So one is that, so as Luke was mentioning, languages that have a sh sound as well as an S sound tend to have an S that's more fronted, that's more like s. And the reason is that if you have s and sh, they're very close together in the mouth. And so you naturally, speakers of a language naturally over time, if they have sounds that are too clustered together and they have space to push them apart, they will, generation to generation, because it's more efficient. Your brain is better at distinguishing sounds that are more different. And so the other piece of evidence is that across Indo-European languages, which are all languages that descend from one common ancestor 5,000 to 6,000 years ago in the Central Asian steppe, so that's everything from the Celtic languages to the Germanic languages to the Italic languages to Greek to the Slavic languages, Baltic, Albanian, Armenian, Indic, Iranian, Persian. I hope I got everything. All of the languages that have developed a sh sound, and we can observe when these sh sounds develop, end up with an S that's more fronted for the most part. So in English, I have the word shirt, right? We also have the word in English skirt. It turns out that these are from the same root, right? They're from the same Germanic root. Shirt is the native English word, and skirt was borrowed from Old Norse, which was spoken by Vikings that came during the Danelaw, which is when they were in control of parts of England and Scotland. And if you listen to modern Icelandic, there was no palatalization of ska before vowels like e or e, which in English ska became sha. So the original word would have been something more like skirt, and then in English it became probably scha, and then scha, and then sha. So if you compare, for instance, the word ship, like a boat in Icelandic, is skip.
And skipper.
Right, skipper, yeah.
And a skiff.
Right, exactly. Those are from the same root, but just from different languages that developed differently. And so Icelandic never developed a sh sound, and Icelandic has this sh, this slightly retracted s sound. You'll hear it if you ever listen to an Icelander speaking English, or if you just listen to Icelandic, they have this retracted s sound. Similarly, Dutch never really developed a sh sound through any kind of palatalization. Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Or yeah. And in Dutch, once again, if you listen to Dutch speakers, they have this very prominent retracted s sound.
I love it. It's great.
There's other examples. Greek, in the dialects that didn't develop a sh sound, so standard modern Greek does not have a sh sound. The s is retracted. Sardinian, which is the only Romance language that didn't develop a sh sound because it didn't undergo palatalization. So Sardinians still say conoscere for conoscere in Italian. And they, in particularly the more conservative dialects that have taken on less influence from Italian, still have this sh sound. And so all throughout the Indo-European languages, there's more examples. You find that the languages that didn't develop a sh or don't have a sh have this more retracted s. And so what that points to is that that's the original inherited sound throughout all branches of Indo-European. And then many languages underwent palatalization processes to develop sh, and then they lost that pronunciation. There's other reasons we could go into for why we also would say that Classical Latin in particular, which had not undergone that palatalization, has that same S sound that you hear in Sardinian or Spanish. The story in Spanish is more complicated, although it's still very good evidence for this, but I don't think we have time to. I would love to talk about the history of sibilant sounds in Spanish in another video.
Let's do that. Let's do that. That'd be cool. And I wanted to add too.
We should do just a video on retracted s because it's such a meme at this point.
Do it. We got time. We're gonna have time real soon. We're gonna make it happen. And I want to add those of you out there. Thanks everyone for these questions are great, and we're gonna try to answer. And your comments are really great too. I'm trying to answer as many as we can for today. If we don't get to them, please leave a comment later on after the live stream is posted, and I or Raphael will respond to you, and we'd love to. So hope we can get to everything we can today. And there's an example. That's a learned alteration I did to my own pronunciation. Can instead of can, which is, I think people around here would say can. I say can now just because I'm in front of a camera and I do audio stuff. I'm like, I like the sound of a can better. It sounds more like Patrick's to it, It's that kind of. There's no good reason for it except that I have an aesthetic preference for it now. I say aesthetic instead of aesthetic, which is normal. I say accept instead of accept for all these. These are weird things that I started to do just for clarity. I mean, instead of clarity, which is what I used to say, clarity, and I would say clarity. So I'm just making fun of myself because I'm hyper conscious about pronunciation. Raphael has no problem, however, being completely himself. And good on him for that, I'd say. Let's see. This is an easy one, I think, to answer, right? How do we know which syllable is stressed in the IPA system? Got a little tick that's to the left of it.
Yeah, there's a little. It almost looks like an apostrophe. If you see that to the left of the stressed syllable, it means that that following syllable is stressed. So like in the English word record, where the re is stressed, there will be a little tick / apostrophe looking thing right before the re. And in the word record, where the chord is stressed, there will be a little apostrophe tick thing before the chord. If you go on Wiktionary or something and you type in those words, you'll see that little tick in the transcription. Yeah.
All right. I'm still catching up here. Give me a second, everyone, if you can. Oh, darn it! Oh, it cut off a whole bunch. That's what I was afraid of. That's why I try to get these earlier ones, because if I missed your, if you asked something before 5:36 p.m. Eastern time, I unfortunately can't look at it now because it just went away. That's the limitation.
Why don't we say, if anyone has any questions, just type it now, and then we can try to respond to like one or two more.
Well, yeah, yeah, that's a good idea. Well, I'm trying to. We also have members here, and I want to make sure we get our members. Hey, again, very good comment. I think Raphael's the are probably palatized in your dieti. Oh, so you're saying dieti instead of dieti.
Dieti.
Dieti. It's closed vowel. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, my Russian is very rusty.
And I think it's because of the palatalization of the following consonant, right?
Right.
Isn't that cool? I love how I learned that.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, there's a rule. It's right. Hold on, I'm skipping through here. And yeah, we do. Raph's the best.
You're the best.
Thanks, man.
I'm just tagging along.
Not to learn vowel length independent of stress in Latin because it doesn't sound natural. I think we addressed that, but
Finns and Hungarians and Japanese people everywhere are crying right now.
I mean, well, it depends. I've done plenty of recordings, older ones especially, where I overemphasize the thing in order to not necessarily sound natural, but for pedagogical reasons. And I would go ahead and, I mean, if you listen to my recent Latin stuff, I think I have a more natural, fluid sound. I'm also constantly studying Italian in order to
that's actually that's a really good point. In terms of the naturalness of vowel length, it's true that often when a lot of people who don't have it in their native language are learning it, because they hear this term long vowels, they think, okay, I have to take the vowels that I already have and make them longer. And so you get people saying like consonants, right, or something, or romanos, or whatever.
Really hammer it or something. The way I used to do when I was trying to pedagogically emphasize.
Right, exactly. Try to emphasize it so people can hear it. But if you listen to a language with vowel length, the key is not to make your long vowels long. It's to make your short vowels really short.
Yeah.
So, for instance,
like,
in Japanese,
fero. Go ahead, Japanese. Yeah.
Or in Japanese, koko, right here, koko. It's not koko. Because if it's not, I don't say koko for here and then koko for high school. I say koko for here and koko for high school. And koko, I mean, that's a perfectly sayable normal word with long vowels.
Koko. Yeah.
The key is to distinguish is to say koko very, very, get that sort of staccato rhythm down. Yes.
Thank you, PMT Lynch, for being a member. Really appreciate it. Thanks. That's kind of you. Ioanni, Evcharisto. This is Ioannis usually frequents the Ancient Greek through Latin on Scorpio Martianus. Thanks for being here. This is a really complicated question, which if you write in the comments, I think we could get to it. So thanks very much because we'd love to, but I think that's a big question. Trudging forward, everyone. This is me making vamping sound. This vamp. Oh, hey. You say thank as well. All right. The linguist.
No, it's spreading. No, I'm kidding.
No, it's been around. I think it's my no. You're going to prescribe yourself not to be a prescriptivist, even if it kills you.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank or you're a thanker. Thus it's basically because if you look at other Western Germanic languages like Dutch or German, it's dank or danke with a duh, right? Basically there's two kinds of there's certain they derive from a the or a th sound, and there was different in the different varieties of older Germanic languages, and it seems, and I'm absolutely not a specialist in this, we should probably ask Jackson Crawford or someone, that that certain Germanic languages had the unvoiced version, and one of them I think was Anglish, the Angles language, whereas West Saxon, the West Saxon had the more the, so th versus the, at least for that word. And English is an example, just like every language, where we have a mix. We're just talking with Davide today about bachos from basho, from basium, as a weird little thing that ends up now it's standard. In my case, my pronunciation of thank isn't standard because I say, well, I guess thank, I think that's the less standard thing because we have this and that. I would anticipate thank to be standard, but it's not
Well,
because of the
this
dominance
and
of
that
English.
are generally unstressed
That's
function
why.
words, which is why you have the voicing there. Because of course, the comes from the originally in Old English, so that was unvoiced. It became voiced.
Ah, voicing came later. Do you think my thing is innovative later during the
Thank.
fusion?
I
Thank
think
instead of thank?
thank is later than thank, definitely, because in Old
But it's
English
in
there was
Western,
no
oh, it's Saxon.
in standard West Saxon there was actually no phonemic difference between the and the. It was just distributional.
What about Fox and the other one, Vixen?
Vixen, right? So Vixen comes from a different dialect than
West Saxon, Old West Saxon, right?
No, I think Vixen comes from.
Oh, okay.
I forget
Well,
what dialect, but
I'm definitely not the expert.
I'm
So
gonna
I
ask.
haven't researched for years.
You should ask. We should ask Jackson Crawford.
We should definitely do that.
We should maybe do one more question, and then I think, unfortunately,
you're right. Hold on. Let me
Yeah.
scan through here. Give me a second. And thanks so much, everyone, as I'm going through this, for all your comments and questions. Looks like you had some good discussion here in the comments as well. And again, please, if we didn't get the chance to cover your question, Graf, hey, thanks for coming a member. I appreciate that, my friend. Yeah, if we don't get to your questions or comments today, then what am I doing? Oh, look, hey, it's Marina. Hey, how you doing? Salve. And let's see. Okay, I think. Ooh, I hope we got some of the questions. No, I don't see any questions. But I rushed through like 20 minutes of comments. Oh, why do some linguists claim that Latin had two sets of o and u sounds that were similar to the ones in English? We were just talking about the. Oh, I was talking about this in the Latin chat yesterday, which is why I was thinking I just talked about this, and I was using the vowel chart. So I will, if I'll go do a little bit of this. Well, if there's one more question for for Raf here. Okay, so this is how it's understood, and Raphael definitely has a lot of good comments on this as well. So the prescribed way on, say, Wikipedia or Wiktionary for the pronunciation of Latin words is based on Sidney Allen's model. And Raph and I don't agree with everything about it, nor does Dr. Calabrese. Even J.N. Adams has statistical evidence which demonstrates why we have some evidence, or I think considerable evidence, not to go along with a specific thing, which is that there ought to be, according to Sidney Allen and others, philologists from the past, as well as some modern folks, a distinction between short E and long E, the short letter I and the long letter I, and the short U and long U. They would say for the short one, like lupus instead of lupus. Instead of I, they would say igitur instead of igitur. Now, I don't think there's anything linguistically wrong with that as being a possibility, but I strongly disagree with it being.
Lithuanian is an example of a language with basically that vowel system. You have the long vowels that are I, U. You have the short vowels that are, I mean, they're not exactly like English I and U, but they're similar.
They're laxish, yeah. They're closer to this one.
Exactly. So it's, that said, I think, yeah, just the modern evidence in the classical period, at least, it doesn't point to that. It points to 5 qualities: e, a, o. I'm doing long and short vowels. U, right? So each pair has the same length, which is a system preserved in Sardinian, for instance. All the long and short vowels merge. The reason why they say that there's different qualities is because, ignoring for a second what they're saying those qualities were, it is actually clear that in the vast majority of Latin, by the end of the classical period, there were differences in, first, in the quality of long e and short e. So instead of e and e, you had e and e, probably, which is equivalent basically to what you have in Italian, where the descendant of long e is pronounced e, and the descendant of short e is pronounced e, or ye in some contexts. And you have the same thing with o and o. the long one raises. It becomes O, right?
Right.
And then that's why in Italian, it's part of the reason why in Italian you have a difference between O and O. And then at the same time, in Italian and the vast majority of Romance languages, short E and short U lower to join that new close mid quality E and O. So that's why...
You think the raising happened first before the short vowel quality
the
change?
raising, I do believe it happened first, yes. That's what I
interesting.
think the evidence points to. Calabrese goes into that.
He does,
But yeah, I think... So basically, it is true that short E and U at one point have to have lowered such that they were pronounced E and O. There doesn't necessarily have to have been an intermediate stage of E and O.
Right. There's nothing wrong with that as linguistic theory, but what Raph and I and Calabrese say is it's simply not necessary. And to prescribe it is the other problem with prescribing it.
And it also probably wasn't already true in the classical period. It's the other thing. We disagree with the dating.
Right, because there's inscriptional evidence which demonstrates all of those changes we just are. There's definitely a change of vowel sounds during and when Latin is a native language, but not from the time period of reconstructed classical Latin phonology, which is the 1st century BC, 1st century AD through the end of the 2nd century. What we see is that the beginnings of spelling errors for front vowels is 2nd century, but none of the back vowels. And it seems
the back vowels are later.
Yeah, and the Eastern Romance, like Romanian, possibly because of the push from Trajan's time and the colonization of Dacia, or maybe not. The point is that Eastern Romance languages like Aromanian and Romanian don't have the back vowel changes. They don't change even au. It's still aur for gold, whereas it's oro in Italian.
Right.
So the back vowels don't change.
They only change the front vowels like Italian. And that's consistent with an inscriptional evidence. And it's also consistent. So it also, there's actually a good deal of evidence which is not reflected in these earlier reconstructions done by, say, Sidney Allen. There's a good deal of evidence that the lowering of short E was initially only in word final syllables in an unstressed context, and then it spread to the rest of the word. So in modern Italian, so like in Latin, you have siccus, right, dry. In modern Italian, it's secco. In Sardinian, it's siccu, right? So preserving the original qualities. And so that lowering happens universally to short E or pretty much universally to short E in Italian and most of Romance. But there's a good deal of evidence that it happened first only at the ends of words. And actually, one very good piece of evidence that I discovered myself, I haven't seen anyone else mention this, although it's probably in some handbook in Italian somewhere that I haven't read. But Sardinian actually has a lowering of short E to E in syllable final position. So normally when you read a description of Sardinian, people say it preserves short E and short U. That's actually not true in words like tibe from tibi or ube from ubi. There's a bunch of other examples of this. Also in the verb conjugations, you see this. And this is consistent with inscriptions from Pompeii and other places where we see E in place of E in this very predictable pattern of word final position, and then slowly spreading to other positions. So yeah, I think if you really, not very many people now are actually care about this, which is why all of the stuff you see on the internet is based on Sidney Allen, which is fine. I mean, it's a great piece of scholarship. But if people actually look at the evidence, I think there are very few linguists who would not be, I mean, you know, I'm biased because it's my own position, but I think there are very few linguists who would look at all the evidence if they had the time and the inclination, and who would not say, oh, okay, you're right, it probably wasn't pronounced the way Sidney Allen is describing. But
yeah, and ultimately the evidence, J.N. Adams, his books really demonstrate that 2nd century onward is when the front vowel changes happen, but not the back vowels until the 4th century AD. Classical Latin is centuries before that, especially if we're going for something very specifically of Ciceronian, if you want to. It doesn't mean you can't attempt later pronunciations. I think that's great, but that's usually not what people are even attempting to do when they speak Latin with a classical Latin pronunciation. So the evidence just doesn't support the conclusion that there necessarily is based on spelling errors and other things. And so I aim for the simpler one. I like it aesthetically as well. I don't blame a single person who wants to use a Sidney Allen system. We can all communicate just
Totally.
fine. Ioanni, you asked a good question, which we don't have time for, but we should do a whole podcast, a whole chat, I think, Rafa, on this. Why is it hard to hide our accent when speaking another language? I don't think we can answer that today. Do you agree with me?
Well, we sort of did answer that. I mean,
yeah, I guess we did.
You know, there's transfer from your native language. That's how you've acquired language initially, and it takes a bit of training. Just like how it takes a bit of training. You know, if you're an Italian learning Spanish, the grammar is very easy to learn. If you're an Italian learning Japanese, the grammar takes a lot of study and practice to learn because it's very, very different. But with study and practice, you can learn any grammar, and that includes phonology. And so the more different from your native way of pronouncing it is, the more explicit study it will take, the more awareness you need to, phonetic and phonological awareness, you need to develop to then benefit from immersion and input to then pronounce the language with that pronunciation. But it's always feasible, even if you're learning a language that's extremely different from the languages you already speak, it's feasible. So, yeah.
Absolutely. If you want to learn phonology as well as beginner Latin, Spanish, or Italian from one of the most knowledgeable people I know, Raphael Turrigiano, this is his website, rturrigiano.wordpress.com, where you can sign up for his lessons. I would not, like I said in the beginning, I wouldn't be where I am today. I wouldn't be in grado di talk about what I am able to talk about today without having benefited from the lessons that you've given me over all these years. So definitely give it a shot. Thanks so much, everyone, for all your comments, questions. If you have more, we'll, over the months, even years perhaps, that if you write comments, whenever you see this in the future, love to get back to you if you have something about this subject. And we'll have Raph back, I think, for another one. Raph, thank you so much for being here and doing this and giving these amazing insights. Thanks.
It's always so much fun. Thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you to everyone. Yeah, definitely.
Grazie a tutti,
Gratias vobis. Ago.
Sì. Servo nosteres latinus. Recte digis. Valete omnes, valete.
Valete. Bye-bye.